honored guests, our first panel of the day, Combating Non-State Actors and Proxy Groups, Lessons Learned, is presented in partnership with Arizona State University and New America. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Daniel Rothenberg, Center Co-Director and Professor of Practice within the Future Security Initiative and Arizona State University and Senior Fellow at New America. He'll be joined by Ms. Candace Rondeaux, the Future Frontlines and Planetary Politics Senior Director at New America and Professor of Practice at Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative. Mr. Peter Bergen, Vice President of Global Studies and Fellows at New America, Center Co-Director and Professor of Practice at Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative and National Security Analyst at CNN. Colonel Jan Gleiman, Professor of Practice at Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative and a Senior Fellow at New America, and Colonel Yanni Koskinas, Chief Executive Officer of the Hoplite Group and Senior Fellow at New America.
Thank you so much, everybody. Special thanks to the Sifan Center and the Qatar International Academy for Security Studies and the government of Qatar. We're really thrilled to be co-sponsoring the forum, and we will go right into our discussion today. Let's start from Peter Bergen, a bit of an overview of where we're at on this issue.
Thank you to the Sifan Group for organizing this. So we've had quite a number of experimentations by the United States in the so-called global war on terror, and I'll just briefly explain what they are and what lessons we can learn from them, if any. So in the first phase, 110 CIA officers and 300 special forces overthrew the Taliban with the help of tens of thousands of Northern Alliance proxy forces with a lot of American air power. That destroyed much of the Taliban and much of Al-Qaeda within 3 months. Unfortunately, because of the false belief that the United States shouldn't replicate the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, when it came to the Battle of Tora Bora, Gary Bernson, who was a CIA officer on the ground, who's here today, requested 800 Rangers. Tommy Franks, who was then the general in charge, refused that request. So the lesson there was, at some point, you do need more manpower, and of course, bin Laden escaped. Flash forward to the war in Iraq, a large-scale conventional army overthrew Saddam within 3 weeks. There was no planning for the day after. Al-Qaeda in Iraq established itself, basically helped foment the civil war. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated basically for 3 reasons. One, Joint Special Operations Command, which at one point was doing two operations a week, which started doing 10 operations a night. Two, something called Real-Time Regional Gateway, which was at one time highly classified National Security Agency program, which basically was capable of ingesting 100 million phone calls a day in Iraq and 100 million voice cuts, meaning the actual content of the call. So basically every phone call in Iraq got inside all the insurgent phone networks. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq was eventually largely damaged. However, it became ISIS. So it demonstrating that you can have a temporary victory, but it's not forever. Of course, one of the reasons that ISIS was able to flourish in Iraq as the United States pulled out of Iraq in December of 2011. The lesson there being the absence of American troops doesn't equal peace, which is a common view on the left of the Democratic Party and the right of the Republican Party. And then the United States, I think, did something fairly successful in Iraq, which is aligning with the counterterrorism service against ISIS, basically Iraqi special operations, and also with Syrian Democratic Forces, a proxy force in Syria, and was able eventually to defeat ISIS. So what are the overall lessons? If there is a lesson for the United States, it is go light and go long, which is the most politically sustainable approach in the United States when you're not spending a great deal of money, you don't have a lot of American casualties, and you're operating with either a host government or a proxy force that is doing a lot of the battle combined with American air power. Is that a perfect answer to every situation? No, but it's probably the least bad answer to many situations.
And now, Dr. Ken Glyman, give us a little bit more overview from some of your experiences as Special Forces Officer.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And I'll talk a little bit more about my experience as a professor and taking some of those experiences as a Special Forces officer and as an academic into the classroom, and some of the things I think are important. I want to use the panel framing and just push back on it just a little bit, very gently, because the panel description suggests that the nature of terrorist groups and non-state actors, militant organizations, is changing. And I think that overstates the case a little bit. I think the nature of these groups remains fairly constant or consistent. The nature of political and criminal violence remains constant. These groups are political actors who have chosen violence or the threat of violence as a necessary tool to obtain and maintain power. That really hasn't changed, and I think it mirrors that well-worn but still really useful adage about the study of war, where the nature of war remains constant, but the character of warfare evolves. I think the same holds true here. And what has changed about the character of non-state groups and how they present themselves is really, how they present themselves and how they mobilize resources and how they operate. And I think a lot of that is driven largely by technological change and some advancements. And now we're seeing, the democratization of technology because of economies of scale, so that there are more exclusive capabilities coming to these actors. And that's important because the lessons from the past, and I mean sometimes the distant past, can be as important as the lessons from the recent past or the present. And I want to focus on two critical shifts that I think are important in sort of this big overview. One is the narrative space, and the other is resource mobilization. And I think these two sort of bigger themes tie into what Peter was talking about in Afghanistan, and I'll tie that in carefully. Now, to be fair, when I think that if a group's internal motivations shift dramatically, one might argue that the nature of a specific group can change. In other words, often those shifts are responses to existential pressures created by resource mobilization constraints. I think that's important because as I talk about these two themes, you'll see that that comes out into how these groups can be defeated or integrated. First is, the narrative space. I think it's well understood that the competition for influence in the narrative space has exploded in the last, pick your number of years, but certainly in the last 20 years. I mean, armed groups have always had to tell their story, but today they don't need a printing press or a radio station. We're nearly 20 years into the smartphone era. And with it, we have a world where anyone, anywhere can reach a relevant population. I think that's really important. Is the ability to reach a relevant population has been critical to a group's success, and often the ability to counter that is very important. I think ISIS exemplified this sort of evolution. They certainly didn't invent propaganda, but it's 10 years ago since we saw them sort of explode onto the scene with this, where they perfected this really fast aesthetic and emotional transmission of narratives. And it took a while. It took a long time, I think, for certainly for the United States, but for a lot of government actors to catch up. And the lesson there wasn't simply, fight propaganda with counter-propaganda. It was that legitimacy is contested in the narrative space long before it's contested in the battlefield, and that countering violent non-state actors demands investment in local narratives, local messengers, and political trust, not just technical communication strategies and development projects. I think, Peter, we were most effective in Afghanistan when we were helping Afghans engage other Afghans on the local level with security forces and empowering them. So kind of an important lesson there. The second general theme, though, that I think is important for this is resource mobilization. The means of mobilizing resources, so when I say resources, people, money, material, these have expanded dramatically. And I take a very broad definition of resources, especially with my students, as things that these groups need. So that can be money, fungible or lootable resources, people, weapons, but also sanctuary and diplomatic support. In conventional warfare, we say that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Well, I tell my students of irregular warfare that amateurs talk narratives and professionals talk resource mobilization. And both are half-truths. I mean, obviously tactics are important, but it's logistics that are often overlooked as decisive root causes of victory. But they reflect a core reality that while narratives capture attention, it's the sustained access to resources that builds that durable power of these non-state actors. Historically, non-state actors had limited options. You had to gather volunteers, donations. If you had territory, you could tax. You could engage in criminal activity. If you had the means, you could reach out to diaspora support. Or, of course, you could take that big risk and go for an external sponsor, where you might lose some of your autonomy. So each of those is fraught with vulnerabilities. But today, and I think we had one panel earlier that really talked about it very well, technology has lowered a lot of these barriers. So cryptocurrencies, shell companies, encrypted transactions, and even access now to means that weren't there before, such as sophisticated drone technologies. Importantly, I think how groups mobilize resources can reshape their identity over time. Some begin politically motivated, but evolve into revenue-driven entities. For example, I'm looking now with my students at the ethnic armies in Myanmar that are sheltering criminal syndicates that are running these pig butchering scams, and how they're able to garner resources from that. And does that change the nature of who they are? I spent a lot of time working with the government of the Philippines fighting the Abu Sayyaf group in the 2000s. And we watched them evolve from a locally inspired jihadi movement into essentially a kidnap for ransom enterprise. And then later, you know, they fatally transformed and joined the Islamic State franchise. But I think the critical lesson there is that understanding how a group mobilizes its resources, its money, its people, its arms, its sanctuary, is essential to defeating it. And it becomes a necessary, but perhaps not a sufficient condition for defeat. So some of my students are surprised when in the irregular warfare classes with a retired colonel who's had this background, they expect to study guerrilla tactics, they expect to study counterterrorist missions, but they end up learning about money laundering. They end up learning about the Financial Action Task Force. They end up learning about equity chain mapping and these important aspects. So I think resource mobilization is really core to the battlefield. And I'll just close by saying that not every problem here demands a combat or a targeting solution. Sophisticated targeting is great, but I tell my students that things like counter-threat finance, it's not an afterthought, it's often the main effort. And if you can if you focus more on squeezing a non-state actor's resources, then you can start targeting other things, and then you can actually get to a negotiating table.
Thank you so much, Ken. Now we'll hear from Candace Rondeaux. Candace is one of the world's experts on the Wagner Group, and her book, Putin's Sledgehammer, is coming out on May 13th.
Thank you, Daniel. I guess I want to start with actually a date, if I can, because I think actually most lessons are best learned from history. And we've had some recent history that's quite remarkable when you think about sort of Russia's approach to using proxy forces in the context of Syria, Ukraine, and elsewhere. And this date actually is maybe one that you don't remember very well because it came after a very dramatic event, which was the Wagner Group's march on Moscow on June 23rd and 24th of 2023. Just a few days later, on the 27th of June, Vladimir Putin got on national television and admitted for the first time in some 30 years that he actually did know the man who had tried to mount a coup against him, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and he knew him well for some 30-odd years. And I think it was a moment where it was a bit unexpected on some level. Not only did he admit to knowing Prigozhin, but he said, we spent $1 billion in 1 year on the Wagner Group for its operations in Ukraine. First lesson, Vladimir Putin has trouble with the truth. And that admission was actually just a fraction of what the Wagner Group ultimately earned for the Russian state. Many people think of the Wagner Group as a private military security company, kind of in the tradition of Blackwater or some of the others that we know. But in reality, the Wagner Group really was a very masterful, lengthy deception operation. It was not a unitary company. It was a network of networks, very much like Ken was referring to. It was a network of shell companies, money launderers, people movers, deal makers, and that was sort of the core of the enterprise, but it was never a unitary company. So the first lesson is deniability is very powerful when it comes to proxy warfare and using paramilitary forces. It can be very empowering for countries that have an asymmetric disadvantage against their rivals. A second lesson is that deception lasts only so long. And I think what we saw with the Wagner Group is that the higher Yevgeny Prigozhin flew in terms of his sort of public profile, the more enticed he became by the idea that he could perhaps be a rival to Putin or Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister at the time, the closer he came to the sun, right? There was sort of this Icarus effect. And there were others who wanted to pull him down. And in many ways, the brand that Prigozhin built, the Wagner brand, which was part sledgehammer, right, part brutality, part mystery, was ultimately undermined by his own troops. People turned against him within his own coterie, and he had many enemies. So I suppose the second lesson is, if you want to challenge a paramilitary operation like the Wagner Group, the first tool in your toolbox is information. And the last thing I think that's really important to understand, and one of the biggest lessons about the Wagner Group, is these actors can be very powerful for extending a state's ability to finance war beyond its own borders. We talk about this as projection of power, but it's actually even more meaningful than that. In many ways, I think it would be very difficult, actually, for the Wagner Group, for Russia to really finance its war in Ukraine if it weren't for the existence of the Wagner Group and its operations in terms of circumventing sanctions, enabling and empowering and arming partners in Africa and the Middle East. And importantly, the Wagner Group has also served as a kind of unifying factor amongst Russia's would-be coalition partners. You have in Africa, in the Sahel in particular, you have, of course, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, many other countries that have sort of signed up. They're critical for regime survival in many cases, but they're also critical for extending Russia's ability to influence outcomes in the UN. And we saw that at play in several instances where African nations came together behind Russia in the vote to sort of look away from what's happening in Ukraine. Lots of lessons, I think, many more to talk about. But most important, I think, really is this question of deception, deniability, and then the antidote being really all about sort of information and accountability.
Thanks so much, Candace. Now, Gianni Koskinas.
Okay, we moved from the Philippines, Afghanistan, the Wagner Group, and I think if you're going to talk about proxy warfare, you end up with Iran as sort of being at a professional sport of proxy warfare. In fact, if you want to think about the Islamic republics' approach to proxy warfare, you obviously have to focus on the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, and then specifically the Quds Force, which is its external paramilitary operations that operate obviously outside of Iranian territory, and they specialize in proxy warfare. But before we talk a little bit about that, I'm a visual person, so I want you to picture a circle, and if you split the circle in half, on the left side, you pick a side, but let's say the left side, you have basically a state that is established that you actually want to counter. On the right side, you have a state that is actually someone that you want to support. In irregular warfare, that's instability on the left is your business, stability on the right is your business, depending how you're operating. The U.S., for example, in the 1980s, focused on proxy warfare in Afghanistan in support of an insurgency to topple the Russian-backed government. Fast forward 2001, we used the proxy force to topple the Taliban, but then spent the next 20 years working in the other space, the stability space, and we struggled in 2021, let's say. We didn't go into the resistance portion where you flip to the Taliban control, but the Iranian and the IRGC Quds Force has been absolute masters in this business, okay? If you think about just in this region, the Houthis down in Yemen, and they started off supporting them as an insurgent group, then now they're supporting them as a proto-state, and they've done wonders in controlling sea lanes and bothering the region for some time. You move on up to Palestine, and you have in Gaza Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That's resistance. So now they are using something in irregular warfare to combat a state, but in the resistance mode. Lebanese Hezbollah. By the way, you can notice Shia and Houthi, Sunni in Palestine, Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia, they can play both sides. They can, obviously, they're very diverse in their approach. And in Lebanese Hezbollah, they're almost within the state, but they are focused on resistance. Go over to Syria, and it is an absolute laboratory for proxy warfare. You have the Iranians sponsored about 30 groups. Some of them were local elements, and mostly local elements in northeast Syria, but they also had Lebanese Hezbollah there. They had Afghan groups. They had Afghan Shia and Pakistani Shia militias. And they all obviously had Iraqi militias that they had sponsored over there. But again, proxy warfare in Syria, you're talking, the Russians had their own proxy warfare elements, and not just Wagner, but also localized elements. And of course, the U.S. had the Syrian Democratic Forces and Free Syria Army near Al-Tanf base, and Turkey, you know, the victor, if you want to think about this in terms of proxy warfare, leveraged its proxy forces to now win Syria. So in many regards, Syria is an absolute, case study in proxy warfare. And then shift over to Iraq, and it's such a complicated issue to think about proxy warfare in Iraq, because is it really proxy? They use them in some ways as proxies to counter U.S. influence, but they are part of the state. And as a matter of fact, they are, if you split that circle, in some ways they're both in instability and how they deal with the foreign enterprise, and in instability to the left, and then stability when it comes to countering ISIS inside Iraq. So IRGC is a unique enterprise that came about in 1979, right after the Islamic Revolution. IRGC Quds Force came about 10 years afterwards, roughly about the time that the Iranian and Iraq war were taking place. A lot of relationships were formed with people that are now in some of these countries during that Iran-Iraq war. A lot of Iraqis, for example, that are now in power in Iraq, some of them had fled to the Iranian side. So, and and one of the success stories for IRGC Quds Force was basically its longest serving commander from about, depending who you talk to, 97, 98 till 2020 was Qasem Soleimani. And this is the prototypical proxy warfare strategy genius as far as I'm concerned. Malevolent, I'm not a fan in terms of, his great works, but I am a fan in terms of respect of your enemy and what he was able to create in the region. So this conference is obviously about lessons learned. I think that I would encourage any student to look at lessons learned with IRGC Quds Force. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gianni. So one of the most important aspects of any sort of reflection and lessons learned is where we're going in the future. And maybe you could, following the same order, just give us a quick sense of what you see as the most dangerous, disturbing trends in non-state actors in the short and maybe medium term.
I think I'll take it from the U.S. government side. I mean, there is basically consensus on the left of the Democratic Party and on the right of the Republican Party that we shouldn't do anything overseas and we should withdraw. The Biden administration was negotiating the full withdrawal of all American troops in Iraq, of which there are 2,500. That's supposed to happen next year. Where that lies with the Trump administration, I'm not sure. But we've already run this videotape before where an absence of American troops produced a vacuum into which ISIS came. So I would say, and we've already seen withdrawals from Syria under the second Trump administration of about 300 or 400 in the last week or so. So there will be, it's hard to predict what Trump will do. If he suddenly realizes we have 2,500 American troops in Iraq, which I don't think he does probably right now, he may well say, well, let's just leave. I don't think that would be a good thing.
Daniel, I'll talk about, I guess, two trends. One is connected to what Peter said. I think one of my biggest concerns is about U.S. disengagement from international institutions, and that is because, as I mentioned in my comments, the criticality of being able to counter the resource mobilization of non-state actors. I mean, this requires cooperation around the world when non-state actors are able to acquire resources through financial transactions, et cetera. So I mentioned the criticality of the Financial Action Task Force, et cetera. Disengagement from international institutions, especially the ones where cooperation is so enabling in countering these forces, I think is absolutely important for the future. So I'm a little worried about that. The second trend, though, is I think that Proxy, at Arizona State University, I also have the privilege of being the editor of Small Wars Journal, and there was an article in that particular journal. I'm sorry, I'm promoting it now, but it was by a friend of mine, our managing editor, that he wrote that proxy is not a pejorative. In other words, it's time to stop thinking about proxy warfare as something that just adversaries do. Benevolent actors can use proxies too. And so understanding how that works and how that can be done effectively, I think, is important, and that will be a trend in the future.
So many concerns. It's too hard to list them in the short time that we have. I think when you think about the Wagner Group now, most people sort of tend to think of it as something that is over. In conversations that I've had with advisors in the U.S. Special Forces, folks who are following Russia's irregular warfare, there's this sense that when Yevgeny Prigozhin died, Wagner died with it. That is really not the case. Wagner Group really was a brand. As much as it was a band of brothers, it was a social movement. It remains a social movement, so much so that some of the sabotage operations that we've been seeing take place in Eastern Europe, really also in the UK, have been deeply connected, actually, to the Wagner Group. There are a couple of different cases that I've been following, looking at, sort of low-life, sort of low-level criminals, locals who've been enticed via Wagner Group branded channels on Telegram to do things like set fire to warehouses in the UK, to plant incendiary devices on cargo planes. There is a point at which, you know, the kind of failure to understand that this is a brand and a network really risks something being escalatory in nature. And certainly I think these sabotage operations, you know, bear a lot of risk for stability in Europe. And I think we've already seen, you know, that there are enough of them now taking place, particularly in Poland, that, you know, there is a risk of an overcorrection or an overreaction, and that could be quite escalatory. So, I mean, that's one worry. And I think the other worry, of course, is the continued you know, use of paramilitary forces in Africa, in particular in the Sahel. I think one thing that might start to bubble up in this coming year that we started to see is with the Wagner Group's footprint in Mali being a little bit unstable after one of the biggest strikes on its military, probably in its history, where in July of 2024, at least 84, maybe about 100 Wagner operatives were killed in an engagement in Mali with Tuareg forces. We've now seen that the Tuareg across the Sahel region have found a pretty good excuse to band together. This is making, you know, neighbors in the neighborhood, namely Libya, quite nervous. But importantly, you also see Algeria now wondering what to do. You know, on the one hand, it's been very close for many, many years, decades really, to Russia, has relied on Russia for its military buildup and cooperation and security. On the other hand, it is confronting a very destabilizing force in the form of Wagner. And I think that there's a lot of concern that, you know, what had been a very tenuous peace between Algeria and its neighbors may be a conflagration relatively soon. So in both instances, you have what is essentially a still very live, active brand, the Wagner Group, and it is enlivening conflicts in Europe and in Africa. And yet, neither the United States nor any of its partners in NATO or anywhere else seem to know what to do about it.
I'll start with the Iranian piece that I spoke about, and then I'll bring it around to the U.S. side because I just can't help it. Okay, so first of all, what's in the future? I think that everybody that's looking at Iran right now is focused on the nuclear talks. I think that there are a bunch of IRGC Quds Force entities that are having strategy sessions about how to rebuild a lot of their axis of resistance that's taken a huge hit in the last couple of years. But they are sophisticated, they're cunning, they're ruthless. They know how to leverage the economy. Sanctions economies are favor elements like IRGC Quds Force. They're patient, they're enduring in their pursuit and ideological beliefs and their primacy. So I think that, do they have blind spots and are they vulnerable? Yes. If you look at since 7th October 2023, you've seen the decimation of quite a few of their proxies, but I think that they're going to rebuild. And to think otherwise, it's naive and you're not paying attention. But one of the ways that they rebuild is that they're smart about how they use money. Iran uses money as seed funding for proxies. And then those proxies end up being money-making enterprises for them, not necessarily money spending. At a minimum, they are self-sufficient. They're not like the US where we need to keep on feeding the beast, you know, every possible chance. They actually create an economy that is able to sustain them. An example, to Ken's point about narratives, many of the proxies have their own TV channels. They have their own, you know, media, both legacy and unconventional. So they know how to achieve the rebirth. It's just whatever that rebirth is going to be. The IRGC Quds Force Axis of Resistance 2.0 coming soon to a theater near you. But in the U.S. side, I think we tend to hyper-conventionalize everything. Irregular warfare is not a sport that you can throw conventional troops at. So I worry not just about how we deal with removal of bases and everything else. I worry about, do we scale back our engagement with our allies? Because irregular warfare, you know, for a special forces officer, this is probably you know, music to your ears, is you're doing it through by, with, and through local partners. Surrogate forces is one thing, but engaging with allies is the premier element here. And so we can't remove ourselves from that. And to conventionalize it, you know, to put the security forces brigades or to, you know, something that is conventional army is just creating a bigger beast that you need to feed. And quite frankly, it's not improving circumstances. The last thing I'll throw in there is, like I mentioned, Qasem Soleimani knew everybody in the region. He'd show up. You know, they'd have their lots of cups of tea were drank by that. In the U.S., a commander is there maybe for 2 years, and then they flip them. And the shift to Indo-PACOM is to me a fool's errand if you think about it in the context that there's a reason why we call it the Middle East. It's right in the middle. You know, China's here, Russia's here, everybody's here. So. You know, for me, being a little bit of a, you know, Middle East focused enterprise, I have to say that this is where, if we go wrong, it's going to be because we forget this.
We're getting towards the end right now. So really briefly, like 30-second answer if you can, starting with Peter. The whole point of a non-state actor is counterposed to a state. And I'm wondering what you see as the most significant elements of leverage that states have to determine what goes on with non-state actors.
I think it just depends where you are. I mean, a comment, 2,500 American troops with air power and Afghan special forces prevented a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. As soon as President Biden said we're withdrawing, the 34 provincial cities of Afghanistan were in government hands. So war is about psychology, and I'm just proffering an example of what not to do.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Peter. I think that the most important thing is political will, right? Up to political will to counter that non-state actor. I think that's generalizably, you know, that's almost always the most important thing. If you don't have that, then everything else is probably not worth it.
I guess I'd say be sure you know that you're dealing with a non-state actor. I think in the case of the Wagner Group, there's this assumption that it is a non-state actor, but there's plenty of evidence to show that there was always strong state control, strong state associations. What Vladimir Putin thinks is private is very different than what the rest of the world thinks of as private, and that has really big implications for international law, in particular international humanitarian law. If we're thinking that these actors are private and sort of reacting that way, the danger is, of course, we're undermining this regime of international law and the protection of civilians and the return to peace, and that's very critical. The last thing I'll say is I think the other critical thing to understand is that if you want to confront these non-state actors, or if you think you're going to confront a paramilitary or proxy force, you need to be prepared to really use intelligence, open source intelligence, wisely. And I think that was one of the great successes. Yevgeny Prigozhin wasn't just taken down by his own hubris. There were many, many people around the world who were arrayed and looking to investigate the many atrocities that the Wagner Group committed over the years. And that was critical, I think, to his undoing and to some degree neutering the power of the Wagner Group on some level.
Thank you all so much for spending a little time with us. It's really an honor to be here with you, and have a good rest of the day.